Welcome to our Monticello live stream. Today we are with Thomas Jefferson, as interpreted by Bill Barker, about his time abroad in France. Please leave your questions in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.
Oh, pardon, pardon. Bonjour, mes amis. Comment allez-vous? Très bien, merci. Welcome indeed to El Monticello, where today's subject could not be the more delightful for me, and I hope for you as well. Because in this year of 18 and 24, we have been blessed to learn that our President, James Monroe, soon to leave office, has invited the hero of our nation, let alone the hero of the French, General the Marquis de Lafayette, to come to visit our nation. I have not seen the general since 1789, when I was last in France. And so this will be a wonderful opportunity to visit with him again, and in fact, for our entire nation to visit with him. Because in the 24 states of our nation, in our population now, 9,600,000, can you imagine? 9 million. We were only 4 million when the general was here last. The general and his party will be visiting all of our states. I doubt it will take him, say 1824, to accomplish this. Naturally, he will be staying through next year, 18 and 25. So this has brought for me an opportunity to reflect upon so many things that I enjoyed during my friendship in Paris with General the Marquis de Lafayette, but in particular, during the time that I was in France, 5 ans dans la belle France, 5 years in France, appreciative of so much that I've tried to bring back to our nation in order to improve the tastes of our countrymen. And I'm not going to deny, not the least of which is this very fine statue of Diana, the huntress. Yes, my Jean-Anton Houdon, who sculpted my own bust, sculpted a very fine bust of the late Dr. Benjamin Franklin, of the late General George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette himself, and I dare say of so many others, including the late King and Queen of France. These likenesses, many say, are like the medium of the stone breathing life, as if we come to life. And I find it no different in this exquisite rendering of Diana, the huntress, the Roman goddess, if you will, of nature, the countryside, childbirth, the moon, darkness. Oh, my. So many things for us to ponder when man, so many thousands of years ago, was trying to draw a cosmos out of chaos for an understanding of things. And did I say, Diana, the goddess of childbirth, from which we all are wont to emanate? I beg your pardon, I'm getting carried away, and I want to hear from you. The curiosities and the questions that you're bringing here today for our conversation about my years in France. So the floor is yours.
Well, why don't we get started from the beginning? Mr. Jefferson, many people know that you are our nation's ambassador to France. Why were you appointed, and for how long did you serve?
Well, it was the commission that I received from our Congress. The Congress was then seated in Annapolis. This was the spring of 1784. We had already learned that the Treaty of Paris had been negotiated and signed the previous October of 1783. So that was with the knowledge that Dr. Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, who helped, along with Henry Lawrence and others, to negotiate that treaty, would soon be returning to our nation. Rightfully so. There was a great deal of old business to continue to pursue. For instance, the strength and the integrity of our Articles of Confederation, which would eventually, of course, result in the Constitutional Convention. So the point is that it was necessary for an American to succeed him as our nation's minister plenipotentiaire. That means minister plenipotentiary, a rank, the ultimate above the rank of an ambassador, who would hold all potentiary powers of our nation's government. And that meant executive, legislative, and judicial. Do you know, many have forgotten, but as we declared our independence back in Philadelphia that July of 1776, it was suggested that both Dr. Franklin and me would sail to France as co-minister plenipotentiaries in order to pursue France, helping us in our American Revolution. Lamentably, I could not go. I was still working on the Constitution of our new Commonwealth of Virginia, and Mrs. Jefferson was in ill health at that time. So I had to turn down the commission, and in my stead, Silas Deane from Connecticut sailed with Dr. Franklin. So after the success of our American Revolution, the idea that Dr. Franklin would be returning home, I suppose they thought about me again, and therefore commissioned me to succeed Dr. Franklin. So with that in mind, taking up that great honor, and certainly willing to see, a new land, if you will. I'm still suffering, I cannot deny, from the untimely death of my dear wife, who passed away in September of 1782, but 2 years earlier, not even 2 years at that time. Nevertheless, I was anxious and ready to represent our nation there in the land of our most generous and strongest ally.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Jefferson. We already have so many people curious about your time in France. Someone was curious that while you were in France, did you ever happen to meet the King and Queen of France? And what did you think of Versailles while there?
Oh, my. Well, who could ever visit Versailles without being overwhelmed entirely by its magnificence in architecture, its extraordinary plan, if you will, and I mean not of the palace itself, so extensive and grand before you, but I mean the landscape design, the gardens that exist all about the Palace of Versailles, particularly on the opposite end from its entrance into that grand courtyard. So I was overwhelmed when I would visit Versailles, and literally nearly every day in my capacity of representing our nation. Why was I there in this capacity? In order to negotiate treaties of trade. So yes, quite naturally, on occasions when I would be there, I would see King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, and would attend official functions at the palace, in which I would see them there, of course, upon their throne. In fact, I will tell you that I was introduced to their majesties, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, in the formal levee that they held for all ambassadors of all nations across the globe visiting France were required to present themselves in the hall of ambassadors, up the grand staircase, if you will. If I remember, as you come into the courtyard, your carriage comes into that grand courtyard. That hall of the ambassadors was to the right, a very long wing to the right, into which you would enter and ascend this grand staircase into the presentational rooms and the throne room. So yes, I did visit with the king and the queen upon that first occasion to be introduced to them, read my credentials. Oh, I'll never forget that. What formality! I would hold my credentials in my left hand, and then as I was announced, I would take about 10 paces, maybe 8, I can't remember precisely. I would doff my hat and bow, and then I would continue another 8 paces. It could have been less by that point, 6. Take off my hat and bow, and then finally appearing before their majesties who were seated on a raised dais, I would then, at a distance, doff my hat, bow, your most gracious majesties, and proceed. Je suis Thomas Jefferson, minister plenipotentiaire des États-Unis, and then read my credentials. So, and then, yes, you had to retreat in the very same fashion. You could not turn your back upon their royal majesties. So I would doff my hat again, and then I would walk backwards about 6 or 8 paces, and then bow accordingly, and then walk backward another 6 or 8 paces, and bow accordingly. Oh, my heavens, such grand formality there at the Palace of Versailles.
That sounds very extravagant, Mr.
It
Jefferson.
was extravagant, extreme, but provoked, of course, power. Nonetheless, intimidation.
Well, other than Versailles, what are some of the other places that you got to visit while in France?
Oh, my heavens, I believe that I traveled all about and throughout La Belle France. I had the opportunity to venture south of Paris, through Bourgogne, to visit all of the various vineyards there, Pommard, Volney, Clos-Vougeot, Meursault, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, all of these. And then, of course, proceed southwards from there down to Provence. Do you know, when I was in Provence, absolutely taken, delighted with Provence. I wrote back, I believe it was to Madame de Tessé. She had a very lovely hotel along the banks of the Seine there, Rive Gauche. I wrote back to her, Madame, when I return to Paris, should I die, will you please send my body back to Provence, and the sun alone will revive me. So I traveled throughout Provence, Arles, Orange, oh, the grand theater, the ancient theater in Orange, the Arc de Triomphe, the ancient Arc de Triomphe in Orange, to Arles, magnificent. Then the Colosseum in Arles was extraordinary as well. The amphitheater, extraordinary as well. I ventured to Nîmes. Oh, Nîmes, I was struck in Nîmes when I first set eyes upon the Maison Carrée. Do you know, I wrote, I gazed upon it like a lover upon his mistress, to the extent that the stocking weavers and silk spinners might have thought me a hypochondriac Englishman ready to end my life with a pistol any moment, because it struck me. Not only what a magnificent temple in all of its perfect proportions of architecture, I believe erected by Caesar Augustus, but most important, that this could represent a temple of justice. There's such magnificent architecture, left standing through the ages, receiving the approbation of the ages because it was so perfect in every way, that this might serve as perhaps the architecture of the Capitol, a Capitol building, perhaps for our Commonwealth here in Virginia. And so, if you will, as a consequence of seeing the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, I then colluded with Charles-Louis Clarenceux, well-known architect, along with his apprentice, Monsieur Fouquet, and we created a beautiful model of what could be the Capitol building of our Commonwealth of Virginia, based upon the Maison Carrée. That model was sent back to the committee, if you will, in Richmond to decide upon, and as you know, they finally did indeed decide upon it. Now, here I'm taking so much time when I'm thinking of all of the places that I traveled throughout France, along the Riviera. I'm not going to deny, I continued beyond eastward from Nîmes, Marseille, of course, and then traveled to Cap Ferrat. From Cap Ferrat, I ventured farther east, ultimately to Monte Carlo, yes, to that tiny little kingdom, enchanting little kingdom. And then beyond that to Menton. Well, then we're getting into some other travels beyond France, because I traveled over 3 ranges of the Alps, then to find myself in the Italies. But that is that's another story. And I should perhaps hold on that, because it was somewhat of an illegal venture. Yes, now let that spike your curiosity as for what I mean. But back to La Belle France. I came back to France after the Italies, and I ventured Nice, Marseille, down to the Canal du Midi, the Languedoc Canal, traveled up that to Carcassonne. Do you know, I took my carriage apart, so that it could sit in the canal boat and I could sit in my carriage in the boat. I heard the most exquisite sounds and melodies of the nightingale like I'd never heard before. I wrote a letter, again, I cannot remember whether it was Madame Helvetius, Madame de Tesse, Madame de La Rochefoucauld. But I said listening to the nightingale was the most enchanting sound. In fact, it is said that my letter describing that experience listening to the nightingale is like poetic prose. I sailed up the canal to the Gironde River. I visited Bordeaux, and of course, outside of Bordeaux, all of the vineyards there, oh, magnifique. Chateau Margaux, Chateau Lafayette, Chateau Latour, and I think amongst the finest, not to diminish the others per se, but the Chateau Haut-Brion. Haut-Brion. In fact, I write Haut-Brion in my memorandum books, O''Brien, O'Brien wine. And amongst the sauternes outside of Bordeaux, Yquem, Chateau Yquem, the finest. Then, of course, I ventured up northwards to La Rochelle, where so many the French Huguenots took leave of France, the Protestant French, to travel to our former colony of Virginia, to settle a little west of Richmond in a place called Mannequin Town there. And their descendants are profuse all throughout our new Commonwealth of Virginia and our nation. Then, of course, up to Brest, then Normandy. Oh, and I cannot deny sailing back to Paris in that trip along the Loire, visiting many of the Grand Chateaux along the Loire, Chamonix, and then connecting with the Seine and finally back to Paris. Now, I could go on because from Paris I journeyed northeast up to Brussels, and from Brussels up to Rotterdam to The Hague to Amsterdam. Well, then I digress now, going on beyond France. But to make a long story short, yes, I delighted in traveling all throughout France at one time or another during those 5 years.
Those are quite the travels. And it sounded like you got a chance to be at some of those famous vineyards. And we have some people that are curious. Michael asks, what wines did you bring back from France? And Thomas is also curious, were there any French wines that were your favorite?
Well, Thomas and Michael, let me see, who should I answer first? Thomas, you asked about my favorite wines. I will tell you this. I think I have always been partial to a very elegant and light claret. A light claret. So amongst those, I would say in Burgundy, Pommard, Volney, Châteauneuf-du-Pape. I should not deny Chambertin, and I think that would answer it. That Hermitage, yes. Now, Thomas, if we go to Bordeaux, I think I've mentioned them already, and I think of all the Margaux and Latour and Lafayette, Haut-Brion. Now, Michael, you're asking me, what was it? You asked, I'm forgetting, I'm thinking nothing. What wines did I bring back with me? Thank you, Michael. I brought back cases of the aforementioned wines. Now, the red wines, and I'll tell you why, because they are the ones that can suffer the voyage across the sea, and the better, in my opinion, when you have them bottled at the source. The reason I say this distinctly is because, first and foremost, you know exactly how much you will be paying for. If you are purchasing barrels, pipes, tons, they are large containers for the transportation of wine. Well, that could be sloshed about a bit in those containers, and you might not have extensively what you had paid for. And also, the wine may be somewhat spoiled. So I think when you transport wine in bottles, they are the safer in the transport, particularly across the Atlantic. You know exactly how much you pay for. And so therefore, I would suggest, if you are so interested, and I'm not diminishing the other wines of the kingdoms of Europe, Sangiovese, of course, and the Italies, Nebbiolo and Barolo, but no matter what wine, make sure that you have them shipped in bottles.
I will definitely remember that next time, Mr. Jefferson. Well, you've talked about some of those people that you've met while in France. Were there any other friends you met while in France, or that you met up with who were already there?
You know, I may tell you that of all of the friends I came to have in France, D'Alembert, of course, Condorcet, Monsieur Pierre, Samuel Dupont, and his family. Oh, we should be ever grateful for them to decide to come settle with us here in America. Of what benefit they have been to us. They arrived, I believe, they arrived the first day of January in 1800, the first day of the new year, the new century, in Newport, Rhode Island. And thank heaven made their way southwards, if you will, New York, and then Philadelphia, and finally their holdings outside of the river port, or seaport, you might say, along the Delaware, of Wilmington. They are in the state of Delaware. I mentioned Dr. Franklin, of course, was a good friend of mine for the short time that we were together in France. Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Adams, of course, were in company with Dr. Franklin and myself on many occasions before the Adams then took up the commission in England. Mr. Adams serving as our nation's minister plenipotentiary to the court of King George III. And yet, the two individuals I am thinking of that we should take the opportunity to engage in entire conversation upon them are Mr. and Mrs. Richard Causeway. Richard and his wife, Maria Causeway. I was introduced to them by John Trumbull, the well-known artist. I'll never forget it. It was there in Paris before the Hall of Bled. The Hall of Bled was a magnificent domed building that essentially housed the grain market in the center of Paris. And what a lovely couple. He, Richard, of course, most accomplished as a miniature artist. He flourished throughout the kingdoms of Europe, most importantly in England, painting quite a number of the royal family there. But his wife, Maria, no less accomplished in the arts. And I say not any the less in miniature painting, but grand painting, some magnificent paintings that she was known to paint, but also in composition, music, if you will, and poetry in kind. Oh, and her manners exquisite. You know, though I met them in France, they were both of English heritage and English lineage. Now, I say this because Maria Causeway was brought up in the Italies. Her father, Charles Hadfield, operated a pension, if you will. You might call it a tavern or an inn that was frequented by many upon the grand tour. So you can imagine many of the English aristocracy, when they came of age and took the grand tour throughout all of the ancient kingdoms of Europe, particularly the Italies and Greece, would have to stay at well-recommended hostelries. So one of those was the Hadfield pension. And so you can imagine Miss Hadfield grew up with quite the international knowledge and acquaintances of so many people. And so therefore, I found her absolutely captivating in her knowledge, let alone her artistry, in our conversation. Oh my, the many times that all three of us were together. And then there were certain times when simply Mrs. Causeway and I were together. Let this be a subject for a future conversation. I welcome it and look forward to engage it with you in your company.
Now, you met a lot of people while in France, but was there anyone from Monticello also with you while you were in France?
Oh, my, yes, of course. I doubt that my daughter, now Mrs. Randolph, but at the time she was unmarried. I'm talking, of course, about Patsy. Patsy Jefferson, my eldest daughter, and I traveled together. I had to realize that though Patsy would certainly be able to make the voyage, that my two youngest daughters then, as I mentioned a bit earlier, Mrs. Jefferson had passed away in 82. And so I realized when I received the commission from Congress in the spring of 84, that my two youngest daughters, little Lucy Elizabeth, who was only 2 years old at that time, and then Polly, or Mariah, who was 4 years old at that time, that they would have to remain back in Virginia. So thank heaven for Auntie Epps, as we affectionately refer to her. That was my wife's sister, Elizabeth Wales Epps, the wife of Francis Epps, who resided at Eppington Plantation there in Chesterfield County. So I decided that would be the best place for them to live while little Patsy and I were together in France. However, Patsy and I could have never journeyed together without James Hemings. James Hemings of the Hemings family I have known for so long, and the late Mrs. Jefferson knew well. In fact, the Hemings family came to live with us at Monticello as part of my late wife's dowry, and coincidentally, referring to Eppington, Frank and Elizabeth Epps plantation in Chesterfield, that is where the Hemings, or at least Bet Hemings, originally resided. So that when I married, or let me say when Mr. Wales married the Epps lady, my wife's mother, who died when my wife was very young as well, then that's when the Hemings family came to live with the Wales at the Forest in Charles City County. My point being, the family, so long acquainted and living here at Monticello for a time, James Hemings had shown quite the interest and proficiency in cooking and in the kitchen. And so it was only natural that we invited James to come with us on our journey. Here's an interesting thing. I had been well schooled in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian when I was a young man. But when I sailed to France, I realized I will have to bone up on my French. After all, it would be necessary in many of the meetings that I had to attend and for the negotiation of treaties and trade. So I studied the French language, and I also made an effort, I've studied it again, also made an effort to learn Spanish. I remember reading extensively Cervantes' fine work, Don Quixote de la Mancha, and so I believe that I became somewhat proficient in Spanish, though I shall simply stop there. Some have their differences of opinion with me. Young Quincy Adams, I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to say that he thinks I tell grand stories, that maybe I was not so proficient in learning the Spanish. But we're talking about James Hemings. Beg your pardon, I so easily ramble away from the subjects at hand, but I enjoy conversation, as you know well. James Hemings could not speak a word of French. When we arrived in Paris, he set about, of course, to oversee the kitchen and our cooking there at the hotel we first had, Rue de Tatabout, later, happily, moving into the Hotel de Langeac. But my point is, over 2 years period in France, James learned the French language, could speak it extensively, well mastering it, and entering into notebooks French recipes in French. My heavens. And when we returned to our nation, you can imagine how James was sought after in these arts. Now, happily for James and for all of us, and yet as a consequence of something very unhappy, my youngest daughter, little Lucy Elizabeth, at the age of only 4 years, passed away, 17 and 86. We had only been in France for 2 years. And so I then decided, Polly, Mariah cannot live there alone, particularly in the sadness of her younger sister passing away. So I wrote to ask if Polly would join us in Paris. Initially, there were several individuals who were suggested to accompany her, but finally it was decided that James' sister, Sally Hemings, about the age of 14 years, would sail over, accompanying Mariah. And so they did. They did indeed sail over, initially docking in England. They stayed with the Adams there in London, and later they came over to join us in Paris. So you have that. Sally Hemings came over to live with her brother and to live with us all together, you might say, like family, while we spent, let me see, that would be another 3 years in Paris before we all then returned home to our nation. So thank you for asking me about others from Monticello coming to join us. We were very happy to have all of us so familiar with our home in Virginia than to experience altogether Paris and all of its magnificent wonders.
Well, many people know that towards the end of your time in Paris, the French Revolution started, and a lot of our guests are curious about your thoughts. Chester, for instance, asks, why do you think the French Revolution turned out so differently from ours?
Chester, this is such a good question. And I would only hope that we continue to ask this question so we can better understand two things. Firstly, as I said earlier, the American Revolution would have never been successful without the aid of France. Never. And let us all be reminded of that when we are visited by General the Marquis de Lafayette later this year. Now, why? Why did what became the French Revolution differ in, what word can I use, in its violence, if you will? The French people turning upon themselves as they did, in the turmoil, in the bloodshed, the bloodbath that it did, the reign of terror, as it became known. Well, no violence, if you will, in battle or warfare should ever be considered peaceful or should ever be considered civilized. No, it is not. And when you think of what we were able to accomplish in our revolution, and then look at what the French ultimately accomplished in their revolution, well, as I have written, you can never transport a people from centuries, let alone millennium, of peasantry or kept down in servitude as subjects of a monarchy. You can never transport them into democracy upon a feather bed. But when you think about our revolution, you must be reminded, for many generations, we were already settled somewhat freely in a new world, in America, in nature itself. The icon of monarchy, the icon of aristocracy, nobility, grand manor houses and the like that were becoming customary, built throughout all of England, were many, many miles removed from us, thousands of miles across the Atlantic. So here in the colonies, the British colonies, yes, generally peaceful, cultivating our soil. Now, no one can deny, when we think of this general peace, this general acknowledgement of self-government, that is, our own masters standing behind the plows to cultivate the soil, tasting the sweetness of liberty, you cannot deny. We were still encumbered by the barbarous custom of slavery, the habits and the laws of enslaving our fellow man. No doubt put upon us by England, yes, we cannot ignore that. And many have written that there was nothing we could do about the enslaving of our fellow man in our colonies before the American Revolution, and we tried, and I was there at the forefront. My summer review of the Rights of British America, the summer of 1774. But the point I wish to drive at, ours was with the knowledge, once we began, as I have written, a frenzy of retaliation, the enforcing of the British monarchy to keep us down in all of our efforts to petition for redress of grievances. As I've said many times, we petitioned till the cows had come home. They never went through. Rising up in that frenzy of retaliation, grasping once more after the victory of our American Revolution, the reins of our plows, conducting, if you will, the cultivation of that soil, having tasted the sweetness of liberty. Yes, that proved, I think, a bit more successful than the French and the majority of people upon this globe, no less entitled to revolution, to grasp the reins of self-government, that the majority of the people have been kept down across this globe for centuries and millennium. They have never tasted that sweetness of liberty. And so there you are, Chester. Whether that is a satisfactory answer, I cannot say. Let history be the test. And let us realize we will always be to the rest of the world the best example if whether our American Revolution was successful or not. That question, is man capable of governing himself? Well, Chester, I think it is common sense. If an individual proves they're incapable of governing themselves, then what makes them capable of governing others? Have we found angels in the forms of kings to govern us? Well, again, Chester, let history answer that question.
Well, that was very profound, Mr. Jefferson. Now, some guests are curious, do you have any specific memories of the French Revolution, like perhaps of the storming of the Bastille?
Well, I will tell you, citizens, I did bear witness to the burning embers of the Bastille, that 14th of July in 1789. I was at Versailles, I mentioned earlier in our conversation, nearly every single day in conducting business. So about a month before, in June of 1789, let me just leave it at this. I knew all about the gathering of the Third Estate in the Jardin de Paume, the tennis court, to take an oath, if you will, to establish a constitutional monarchy. But my point is, none of us, no one, let alone the French and myself, Americans from all over the kingdoms of Europe, no one ever thought that that oath in the tennis court, that the storming of the Bastille, the dismantling of the Bastille, releasing only 7 political prisoners, would ever lead to what became the French Revolution. No one ever thought it. Again, we were trying to, and I say we, because remember, this was not solely the French unto themselves. These were collaborative efforts. Our nation was nonetheless encouraging of a constitutional monarchy in France. We've always been interrelated, have we not? Our nation has never stood alone, thank heaven. I'm not going to deny President Monroe's recent, his dictate, more or less, in a doctrine that we be protected and defended right in our hemisphere along our coast. And yes, but that still does not deny international trade and support of one and the other nations. So this is certainly something that we were endeavoring to do to help the French engage a constitutional monarchy. This is why I drafted the Bill of Rights and the Citizen with the General the Marquis de Lafayette. So I can only assure you, no, we did not realize, nor did I think when I passed by the burning embers of the Bastille, that this would evolve in what became known, and history will know, as the French Revolution.
You've given us a lot to think about today, Mr. Jefferson. So for one last question, have you lately received any news from your friends still in France?
The news I could not hold back from the very beginning. It is the news that our friend, General the Marquis de Lafayette, will be returning to our nation to visit us this very year of 24. We expect him perhaps here at Monticello, the middle of November. I would wager now about, I would say, the 17th of November. But remember, you can never tell a horse what time you want to arrive. So this is the news that I have received. This is the news that President Monroe is most happy to let us all know that before he leaves office, that he might have the opportunity to greet our hero at the president's house and to travel with him to some locations as the general begins his journey throughout our 24 states. So I dare say this is the happiest news that I've received, that we've all received, and therefore, if you will, well, now, I should not provide a toast simply by me holding one glass. Oh, I think I should venture to offer you all a glass as well. And that is in that toast to welcome Vive la France, Vive les États Unis.